My name is Bob Strong. I'm a longtime member of the politics department. And along with my colleagues Mark Rush and Lucas Morel, have in the last couple of years tried to organize a series of what we're calling Conversations in the Age of Trump. We've tried to invite people to Lexington familiar with what's happening today in American politics and ask them to reflect with our students about some of the broader meanings of the political time in which we live. This afternoon's program is sponsored by the Department of Journalism and by the William Lyon Wilson II Symposium Fund, administered in the Williams School. Our guest is Peter Baker. He is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times and a long-time correspondent of the American presidency. He's covered the Clinton administration, George W. Bush, Obama, and Trump. Along the way, he and his wife served as foreign bureau chiefs in Moscow, and he's written a book about Putin, as well as books about Bush and Cheney, a book about the Clinton impeachment. We're really lucky to have him this afternoon. And this is a real conversation. There's no lecture. I'm going to get us started, ask a few questions, and then two students in the front row, each of whom has a microphone, will bring those of you who want to ask questions that microphone. We really need you to use it. If you don't use it, the people watching on the live stream won't know what question has been asked, and the acoustics in this room don't work very well either unless you have a chance to use a microphone when you ask your question. Our guest is open to any questions you want to ask, but I get to start. The students on the Washington Lee campus have either cast a vote in one presidential election or in no presidential election. For the most part, they don't know a great deal about Barack Obama, though he served in earlier stages of their lives and education. They really only know Donald Trump. If you were a teacher here in our journalism department, or you could be a teacher in our politics department too, if you were a teacher here, how would you explain to WNL students what a normal presidency is?
Well, it's a great question. Bob, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here at WNL. I'm a Virginian by birth and by lifelong living here in Virginia and in DC, and I'm so thrilled to be back here. I covered Virginia and wrote stories from WNL way back in the day, so for me it's a little bit of a homecoming.
You wrote about VMI, too.
I wrote about VMI, in fact.
They made more news than we did.
I wrote before the students here were actually even a glimmer in their moms and dads' eyes, so it's been a while, but it's a great delight to be here. Lexington's a beautiful town, and I'm thrilled to be invited to be sharing this evening with you. The students I met earlier, by the way, were just fabulous. For those of you who have sons and daughters here, for those of you who have friends and classmates here, you have a lot to be proud of. What is a normal presidency? But basically, you take President Trump, and then you do everything the opposite, and that's what a normal presidency would be like. He has been very consciously a disruptor of Washington, the swamp, as he puts it, a disruptor of the presidency, a disruptor of tradition. He is the first president ever to serve in the White House without having spent a day in public office with the military, which I think is important to remember. He comes in fresh. That's what a lot of people like about him. They like that he was somebody who wasn't part of the system, at least in theory, that he wasn't going to go along to get along. But as a result of that, he doesn't come in with sort of the understanding of how things work the way President Bush, who Bob has written a new book that's coming out about, did, about the presidents I covered, Clinton or the younger Bush, Obama. The boundaries they saw, he doesn't see. When people tell him this is the way it's always been done, that's a surefire way of making sure he doesn't do it. If they tell him you can't do it, that's another way to make sure he does do something. So I think that he treats everything as an open book. He's not wedded to anything as it was done before. Obviously, there are good aspects of that and bad aspects of that, and we can debate that all we like. But he is somebody untethered from the traditions and the mores of the presidency writ large. And I think we see that every day. As a reporter, obviously, we see that in both the way he interacts with us, in both a positive way sometimes and a negative way sometimes. He talks to us more than any president I've ever covered. He talks to us so many times that I've been on trips with him. I kind of pray he won't come to the back of the plane because I'm tired and I just want to eat a meal. That's a good thing from my point of view. I enjoy having more interactions with the president. As a reporter, you have more chances to ask questions. Obviously, there's a different side where he has taken a much more hostile view of my colleagues and me than most presidents do. Most presidents don't like reporters all that much, let's be honest. But most of them don't call us names in quite the frequency that this one does. So there's a tension there in that relationship that's pretty stark. But across the board, I would say that if you're looking for a normal presidency, this would not be the one.
Okay. You've been to Lexington before. You know about Washington, Lee. We have a time-honored honor system. This is a community that cares a lot about honesty.
Yeah.
And we're in a really unusual period of time, given the fact that the president's connection with truth is limited. And many American voters probably think that all politicians lie. You can tell when a politician is lying because his lips are moving. For Donald Trump, he lies when his thumbs are moving. They think that's what Washington works on. But I'm not sure that's true. I always thought if a member of Congress promises how they're going to vote on a bill, those promises have to be good or you cease to be an effective legislator. In your line of work, if someone tells you something and says, don't put my name on it, and you put their name on it, you're cooked. You're done. Has the president's rhetoric and the president's propensity for saying things that are false or misleading soured everything in Washington, or is he an exception to a community that still has some level of trust?
That's a great question. I think that we should not look at President Trump as a representative of other politicians per se. I don't think that the things that work for him necessarily work for others. I think he's sui generis. Maybe that there are other politicians who try to emulate the things that they think work for him, but he is a unique individual, a unique talent in the way he has succeeded in politics. I think if a politician came along and says, well, I can do the things that he's done, I can fill in the blank, this, that, and the other thing, and I'll be able to still succeed at the polls, I think they would be taking their chances in their hands. I don't think that the rules of political gravity, laws of political gravity have been suspended for everybody. They do seem like they've been suspended for him at times, right? I mean, it's hard to imagine somebody being elected president who has, all the things that the Access Hollywood tape, the fraud lawsuit with Trump University, the mocking of Mexicans and disabled people and veterans, and all the things that made him so controversial to most voters, a lot of voters, in 2016, and yet he got elected anyway, also make him appealing to the people who really admire him. To many of us, we look at him and we have tabulated the number of false and misleading statements he's made. The Washington Post has it over 13,000 things that he has said since he took office that were not completely true, right? 13,000. And we say, all presidents lie. That's an easy crutch. It is true that politicians are not the most honest people in the world always. But the truth is, I think that most politicians actually try to go out of their way if not to lie, at least not to be caught lying, right? Because there has always been a cost to that in our system. If you get caught as a politician saying something that's not true, somebody's going to ding you for it, and there's a cost to it. Nobody likes, or at least used to like, having a newspaper story saying, this politician just told you something that's not true. They try to avoid it. Even if they were trying to mislead, they would at least be technically accurate in the way they would say something that wasn't true. This is different. This is just very different. This president is unlike any politician.
All right. How does he do it without paying a price?
Well,
how does he do it
I think,
without a cost, or do it repeatedly with a lower cost than most people would have guessed?
Part of it is he doesn't care, right? He doesn't care if we have fact checkers saying 4 Pinocchios or, pants on fire, or how could you say this is not true? Doesn't care. Because if he did care, it's one thing to say something is not true once or twice. You may be misinformed, you may have just gotten something wrong, you're pulling something out of your memory that's bad. There are a lot of things he says that he repeats again and again and again and again. He's been told again and again and again are not true, and he repeats it anyway. Okay, when you do that, you can assume that there's a certain knowledge base, and he's either convinced himself of something and thinks everybody else is wrong, or he genuinely is intentionally not telling the truth. And he doesn't care that we ding him for it. He doesn't care that people say, like that. Other politicians do. And I think the other thing to remember is there are a lot of people out there who thinks he is actually the more honest person than anybody else in Washington. That in a way, and I get this, right? In a way, he speaks truth in a larger sense than most of our politicians, because he describes exactly what he's thinking. He doesn't hide his motivations very well, right? I mean, he'll say out loud the things other people would be trying to hide from us. And he uses that. He says, well, how could I be doing something wrong? I told you what I was doing, right? I told the Justice Department to investigate my enemies. And I told my chief of staff to stop the Mueller investigation, whatever. He is open about the things he does that other presidents would have tried to hide. And in a way, that works for him because he seems more transparent rather than less to at least a lot of people who admire him.
And I have a kind of related question about Washington today. I don't know much about your line of work, but I presume that there is a base of knowledge that you have put into your New York Times stories, and there are things that people have told you off the record, in private, have asked you not to publish, and that there's a different level there. Is the distance between what you've told us and what you can't tell us greater in the Trump era, narrower, or about the same as it is in most administrations?
That's a good question. You're right. I mean, look, reporters interact with sources all the time and who tell us things off the record that we can't use. I would hope, and we should not anyway, publish stories that are diametrically opposite to what we know to be the case. In other words, if somebody says to me, the sky is blue, and then off the record says, it's raining, I'm not going to publish the person's quoting on the record saying the sky is blue because I know he's just said that. I actually had a friend who covered Iraq during the Iraq War, and a person who was speaking for the American Coalition Provisional Authority there, the CPA, said on the record, things are going badly, the war is going badly. On the record, everything is fine. Off the record, Rome is burning. And my view is I'm not going to publish the on the record thing knowing this person has told me something completely opposite off the record, because I don't think that's honest to our readers.
So are the off-the-record conversations today further from what we read, or?
I think in some ways maybe less. I don't know.
Less.
It's an interesting question because this is a White House that has been, it's a White House that leaks. It's a White House that's been transparent to some degree in its internal tribal factions and internal fights. Again, I don't think that they feel the need to hide certain things that other politicians need to hide. So in some ways, we may be closer to it. One thing I'll say is, in doing this for a long time, I've learned that when you write a story about something that's going on inside a White House, and the White House denies it, no, that's not true, the Secretary of Defense isn't fighting with the Secretary of State. Not only is it true, it's so much more true than we even know at the time. Like, we were only getting 10% or 15%, and then you read the memoirs later, the oral histories like the ones you've done for the Miller Center, and you learn later on, not only did we just only barely scratch the surface of something. And so when they deny stuff, I take that with a grain of salt, because it's almost always the case that things are more rather than less.
And I want to ask one final question and then open it to everyone here. If everyone who worked for Donald Trump kept a diary and recorded an honest account of what they had seen and heard, and you could read one of them, whose diary would you want to read?
Is Melania count?
She does. You would like to know what her account of... Okay.
I would be curious, wouldn't you?
Yes.
I don't know what she
Yes.
thinks. I really don't. She's very quiet. She's very reserved, keeps to herself, and I would say I have very little sense of who she is and what she thinks.
All right. Again, we have two students, two handheld microphones. They're going to bring them to those of you who would like to ask questions, and we'll get started as soon as someone has a microphone.
Thank you. Would you care to offer an opinion as to the identity of the writer of the anonymous op-ed and a warning?
For those the question is who might Anonymous be, who wrote the op-ed and now has a book coming out? I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, one thing you should know is that the New York Times really does have separate news and editorial sections. People don't understand that or believe it maybe, but that's totally true. The people who do the editorials and the columnists are a completely different part of our organization than those of us in the newsroom who are reporting the news. So when they published that anonymous column a year ago, I found out about it at the same time everybody else did when I saw it on my screen. Nobody had even given us a heads up that it was coming. And to this day, a year later, nobody internally anyway has told me who it is. I have made my guesses, and my friends and sources we've all kind of played this guessing game. What if it's so-and-so? What if it's so-and-so? I'm not going to play them here, sorry. The truth is everybody I've come up with doesn't make sense in this reason or that reason, so I'm still curious. I'll tell you this, I'm stunned that we don't know. I thought for sure we would know within a few weeks. I thought for sure we would know. It's almost hard to imagine that Washington could keep that secret, right? It's not a town that keeps secrets all that great. And I figured, when you guys, some of you are young, but there's a book that came out during the Clinton years called Primary Colors by Joe Klein. You remember this. And it was marketed under Anonymous, right? And it was, who's Anonymous? Is it George Stephanopoulos? It was very insider. It was a fiction book, but it was very insider on how Clinton's world worked. People thought it could be George Stephanopoulos, it could be James Carville, who could it be? And it turned out to be this magazine writer, Joe Klein. And people figured it out by, I think they got a draft of his manuscript and compared like handwriting to, so I'm stunned we haven't figured that out yet. And it'll be hard to imagine he's coming out with a 250-page book or whatever it is, and there are not enough details in there for us to figure out. I said he, by the way, I don't even know if it's a he, it could be a she. It'd be stunning if we don't figure out through 250 pages of text enough clues to narrow it down.
Similar to the first question, how much do you rely on anonymous sources in the Trump White House as compared to past presidents?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing you should know, I realized, it took me a long time until I realized people didn't always get this. Anonymous sources are not anonymous to us, right? I think some people think that we just accept a guy calling on the phone and I don't know who the person is, I just type it up. That's not the case. We know who the anonymous sources are before we publish anything, and we only publish it if we think this person has some credibility, some reason to know what they're saying, and we can, especially if we can back it up with somebody else. I think we've actually imposed a policy in the last few years that has fewer anonymous sources now in the paper than we ever had before, at least in terms of quotations anyway. Our policy now is we don't quote anybody with quote marks without a name. We'll use information from an unnamed source, and we'll say, a senior official who couldn't be named told us this or that, the other thing. But we've cut out the quote marks. We've cut out like direct quotes, partly because we were letting people get away, frankly, with offering a lot of opinions without taking responsibility for it by having their names attached, Quote, Trump is fill in the blank. Great, terrible, whatever. Quote, said an unnamed. Why would we publish that? That doesn't make any sense for us to let somebody do that. So we've cut that out. Our use of, therefore, anonymous sources is now more restricted to what it should be, which is to provide information that we wouldn't get elsewhere. Not opinions, but information. And because we think that readers find anonymous sources less credible, and understandably so. I want to know who's saying something, and so we're trying to be tougher on it. But there are still anonymous sources in Washington. There always will be. Remember, this is a president who himself used to be an anonymous source when he was in real estate. So, keep that in mind when you read some of the old stories about him in the New York tabloids.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Would you respond to a theory that I have? If Trump starts losing rapport in the Republican Senate, that he might get rid of Mike Pence by some method or another, so that, and not go by the 25th Amendment and nominate someone to take his place or drag his feet in doing so, which would leave Nancy Pelosi, obviously, as the next one in line, which would be a very, I think the Republican Senate would be very interested in putting her in by removing him. Do you think that that is a feasible theory? And if so, how would he get rid of Mike Pence? Could he, could he simply ask him to step down or take him on Fifth Avenue and shoot him?
I don't think the latter. Look, 3 years ago, we would all said, well, that's a fun movie script, but has no bearing in reality, right? I think one thing we learned in the last 3 years is don't rule anything out. But to the extent that you could rule anything out, I don't see that scenario happening. As you put it, he can't just fire Mike Pence. Mike Pence is a constitutional officer, elected in the same way he is, and therefore, except for impeachment, cannot be removed from office. He can ask him to step down, and Mike Pence might say yes for some reason. I don't know why he would, but beyond that, he can't just simply fire him the way he's fired everybody else in his White House at one point or another. One reason why the vice president is the only person who was there on day one who's still there. It's an interesting scenario. What's interesting is not the conversation has not yet turned in Washington to Pence as the alternative. It's interesting, right? Because if he's impeached and removed from office, which I still think is an unlikely scenario, Pence becomes president. You have not yet heard the debate be, well, is it better if Pence is president or better if Trump is president? And for each party, it might be a different answer, right? Or even within the party, there might be a debate. I've heard Democrats say, we're better off with Trump than Pence because we have a better chance of beating Trump, and Pence might actually, win in 2020, so let's stick with Trump. Or Pence is more conservative in a genuine way than Trump, who's more hard to predict. But the truth is that conversation has yet to come before, and it's probably because, in fact, the Senate conviction still seems pretty unlikely. It would require 20 Republican senators to break with President Trump, 20. And right now, you and I could name a couple, maybe 5 or 6 under the most radical interpretation. Absent new facts or a new political dynamic, his poll numbers going really down or some new smoking gun evidence, I don't see 20 breaking with him right now. So I think he feels comfortable that he's not going to be removed from office. And so his strategy is, okay, I'm going to be impeached, make it as party line as possible, so therefore it remains seen as a Democratic plot, and then take the issue to the voters in 2020.
Hi, thank you for being here. Appreciate it. It's very interesting. My question is, earlier you all talked about how this is not a normal presidency. And my question is, could we ever go back to a normal presidency? Or have things so fundamentally shifted towards a politics of spectacle, something that the public even demands through social media or 24-hour news cycles? Yeah. Can we ever have a boring old president again?
A boring president. Yes. I mean, look, nothing is permanent. Some things will change, have changed, and will change regardless of Trump, right? Social media is not going away. As you put it, the 24-hour acceleration of our news and our politics is not going to get slower as a result of Trump leaving office whenever he does. But I do think that history in America moves in cycles. And there are moments when we have, a lot of this and less of that, and then we change around. I think that the next president, whoever it is, Democrat or Republican, will likely feel the imperative to show that they're different. Just to be a contrast, for a couple of reasons. One, that's just a natural pattern of things. David Axelrod, who was Barack Obama's senior advisor, said in the next president, we look for a remedy, not a replica, right? We're looking for somebody different because even if we like the old president, we tend to get tired of them and look for something different. And I think the politics of this will be for the next president to show that they're trying to restore a semblance of calm or less, divisiveness or whatever. I think that imperative will be there. It doesn't mean that Trumpism will go away. right? That's still, Trump is not, he's not the creation of what's happening in America. And it will not end when he goes away. What will be interesting to see is how the next president addresses that. How does the next president, again, Republican or Democrat, address the people who brought President Trump to power because they felt disenchanted with the system, because they felt disconnected or trod upon or whatever. And that dynamic will be there no matter who is next in line. And it will be interesting to see whether that can be harnessed or addressed or that evolves, or whether we're in for a period of continued polarization.
If we had 2 impeachments in roughly 20 years, and both of them could be described as partisan in the House of Representatives, both of them resulted in acquittals, would that kill the constitutional language about impeachment and either make them common and futile in the future or make them hardly ever attempted in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the one lesson we learned from the 3 impeachment efforts we've seen, Andrew Johnson, Richard Nixon, and Bill Clinton, is that the only way it works in terms of removing a president from office is if it's bipartisan, right? In other words, if there's a broader consensus than just the opposition party. It's not enough for the opposition party to say we don't like the guy in there, because the opposition party never likes the other guy, the other party's person in there. They have to be able to convince the president's own supporters that something has gone awry, because otherwise it feels illegitimate. Right? It just feels like sore losers who are trying to undo an election they lost. And that's the argument you hear President Trump make. So I do think that will crystallize that dynamic in the future so that Nancy Pelosi got that lesson from 20 years ago, and she said that. That's one reason she was reluctant to start this in the first place. She says, I don't want to do this if it's not going to be bipartisan, because she understood that. She may think, and it may be right, that she may yet find Republican support for it. There's not a lot of evidence of that yet. That may change. It's hard to know. People remind us, and they're right, that Nixon's support among his own party stayed pretty strong up until the last few weeks when the evidence really came out hard against him, the smoking gun tape. And so we shouldn't assume everything stays the same just because that's the way it looks today. But I think you're right that the lesson, if it comes to what we think it is, a party line vote in the House, an acquittal or a dismissal or something in the Senate, then it will be seen in the future as a tool only in circumstances that are so egregious and so bipartisan as to take it off the table, particularly if he wins a re-election.
The person in the inner circle who seems to have lasted as long as Pence is Stephen Miller. Maybe you can think of somebody else, but
Yes.
That's the only one I can think of.
You're right.
And I'm wondering your general comments on what his influence, how he's lasted so long, and what his influence is within the administration. And would you agree with my opinion that he's the Dick Cheney of this administration?
You're right about that. Stephen Miller has been around since the beginning. He is a survivor. He came in with Jeff Sessions. He was a Jeff Sessions guy. Jeff Sessions is long gone, and Stephen Miller is still there. He was allied at times with Stephen Bannon. Stephen Bannon's gone. Stephen Miller is still there. One thing he did very well early on was to make common cause with Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump. They liked him. They liked his loyalty to the president. He managed to work with them on policy that they cared about. That's helpful in the Trump White House, is to be on the right side of the Jared and Ivanka divide here. You don't want to be on the wrong side of them, because family doesn't go, hired staff goes, right? So that's one thing he's done, I think, to stick around. The other thing is I think he's genuinely channeling where the president is. I don't think the president has a lot of strong ideological convictions about most things, but one thing he really genuinely does feel is this immigration thing. That's a strong thing for him, and that's something that Stephen Miller not only shares, but finds a way of giving voice to. So he has been, the Trump whisperer when it comes to tough, immigration policies. I don't know that I consider him the Dick Cheney of this administration. I did write a book about Bush and Cheney. Cheney is a very, obviously Dick Cheney is very conservative. He's a different kind of conservative than Stephen Miller in a lot of ways. The interesting thing about that story is I think that people probably overstate how much Cheney ran the White House, which is the common, shorthand. He had a lot of influence, particularly in the early years when Bush was still relatively new and leaned on Cheney, especially who had national security experience. By the end of the second term, the two of them were really on the outs. They were on opposite sides of most issues, most of the big issues that were confronting their White House, whether it be Iran or Russia or North Korea. They were really, they were not in agreement on a lot of things. And their last big interaction before they left office was to have a big fight in the Oval Office about whether to pardon Scooter Libby. Dick Cheney, who was his chief of staff, had been convicted in the CIA leak case. He wanted a pardon for Libby, and Bush refused to do it. So the two of them basically haven't really spoken too much ever since. But that's not what you came here to talk about.
Hi. I'm the editor-in-chief of the student newspaper here, so student press means a lot to me.
Have a hand, yeah. Student newspapers.
So regarding your story on Kurt Volker's resignation, which was first reported by the state press, what was your reaction to being scooped by a college journalist?
Yes, good.
And what do you think it says about the role of student media today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Kurt Volker was the special envoy for Ukraine, who's in the midst of all this stuff going on right now, and he stepped down from that role a couple weeks ago. And the first people who reported it were the student journalists at Arizona State University, which is great. Arizona State University houses the McCain Institute of Public Policy, which is where Kurt Volker worked full-time at the time. He's now since left that job too. The special envoy job was a part-time, unpaid position that he had. And the students got it. They got the scoop. It was a great scoop. We credited them in our story. And then we did a separate story the next day pointing out that they got that scoop. And I think it reminds us that you guys have a big role to play. It's no longer just, banal stories about campus goings on. We need student journalists to step up these days and cover the big issues as well. Journalism is in a period of flux. A lot of our smaller town papers and our medium-sized city papers are going away. I read a story the other day, I think that we wrote, in our paper about Michigan, where I think the Ann Arbor paper has gone away, and the students have stepped up, and they're the only ones there covering the city council and trying to hold them accountable. Thank God for that. What worries me is not journalism in Washington. We've got a lot of journalism in Washington. We may not have some of the same organizations that were big in Washington a generation ago when I started, but others have come along to replace them. New things like Politico, which my wife was the editor of, BuzzFeed or Huffington Post or the Daily Caller or whatever. There's a proliferation of media in Washington. We are really, really good in Washington. What I worry about is Lexington. I worry about Richmond. I worry about Chicago and Miami and places where it is harder and harder and harder for these papers to exist, and there is nothing else. Nobody else to hold local and state government to account and to bring to readers stories that really matter to them. And so I think the ASU scoop is an example where students are stepping forward and need to step forward to provide as much coverage for their communities as they can.
Hi, yes, sorry. You're just everything you were talking about bounces perfectly towards what I was going to ask you. Obviously, a persistent theme throughout this administration in particular and over the past few years has been the questioning and even the challenging of the truthfulness of truth and the factuality of facts. So has this sentiment, or how have you seen this sentiment somewhat reflect on the people who are in your line of work and the people who you are working around? I mean, is it business as usual, or is there more of a sort of pressure that you're seeing that is then somewhat reflecting on the work that's done, the scrutiny that is basically put forth in the work that you are doing?
It's a great question. It really is one of the fundamental questions of our moment. It really is. What is truth? How do we hold on to the idea that we have, a common set of, understandings about the world around us, right? When I was growing up, when Bob was growing up, we had 3 networks, a couple big papers, and the wire services, and that was pretty much the determinant of what the news was. So you would have a common understanding of what the facts were, and then we would argue about what they meant, right? We'd all, right or left, we would sit there and say, okay, now that we know what the facts are, we'll butt heads and have a good, healthy debate. Today we live in different fact environments, right? You can watch MSNBC, which I'm an analyst on, or watch Fox News or CNN. You can read Huffington Post or the Daily Caller. You can have a very different understanding of the world around you. And I always tell people, I said, if you like one of these channels, it's great. Watch the other one from time to time, just so you understand that there's, there are different ways to see the world out there. But it's caused a real challenge, I think, for our conversation, our national conversation, if we're not even starting off on the same page as to understanding what the details are, the facts are. And as a newspaper, our worry is, of course, our credibility. The only thing we have is our credibility, right? Because who's going to buy us if they don't believe us? So to us, being factual, being fair, being accurate, being correct is the most important thing we do. Absolutely. And we're under siege. The president says fake news. He says failing New York Times, and he's trying to attack our credibility. He's trying to tell everybody, don't believe them. They're not telling you the truth. They're lying. They're making stuff up. And it's not our job to fight with the president, right? So we're not going to sit there and argue with him. But what we have to do is create a product that is as reliable and credible and truthful and fair and honest, accurate as we possibly can. And that then leads to the question of how do you cover a president who isn't always those things, right? We have hired a full-time fact checker in our bureau who does nothing but fact check the president and other people in Washington to help our readers understand what they're saying and how it comports with the facts as we understand them. That's a good thing. We should have been doing that all along, probably, but we're doing more of that. We've always done it all along, but we're now doing it in a more sophisticated and intense way. But we also can't get in an argument with the president where it looks like we're like a nyan. Like if we sit there and scold him for every single word he says and says, that's not true, that's not true, that's not true, or this could be true, but you're missing this. There's a challenge to us to both hold a person of power accountable for telling the truth and not drifting into the opposition, because we're not the opposition, and we shouldn't be the opposition. You shouldn't want us to be the opposition. He wants us to be the opposition, right? It's easier to discredit us by saying the media is the same thing as the Democrats. We're not, okay? We're not. And we shouldn't be, because that's not our role. But the best we can do at this point is to try to be transparent about what we do. When we make mistakes, and we do make mistakes, own up to them, correct them, which we do. We have a very vigorous corrections policy. And then try to hope that people see that what we're doing is not the same thing as what partisan figures do, that we are actually trying to cut through the partisan material to give you facts, help you make up your own mind about what you think of things.
Have you lost or gained readers in the era of fake news?
Oh, we're way up.
Way up.
Way up. No, if we're the failing New York Times, let's pray we keep on failing, because we're failing really well. No, we have more. I've forgotten the number.
I'm sorry, it's not wood.
Knock on something.
Yeah.
We have more readers now than any time in history of the New York Times, by far. Okay. By far. We have, I'm going to get this number wrong, but more than 1 million more paid readers than we had when Trump took office. And we're doing very well financially. Don't let them tell you otherwise. Thanks to you. Thanks to our readers, by the way. The subscription model has changed our business. Our business used to be, newspapers used to rely on advertising for the most part. We charge you a quarter because we needed to tell the advertisers the only people who really cared about the paper would buy it. Now we don't have advertising nearly as much, and the majority of our money comes from you, from our subscribers. Thank God for people who read the paper. So thank everybody who reads the paper in here, because you're helping us do our job.
Hi, sorry I interrupted you.
No, sorry, I interrupted you.
So Monica Lewinsky was here speaking to us, I think last week, and obviously spoke to the media during Bill Clinton's impeachment. So I was just wondering, have you seen any change in how the media has depicted or reported the Trump impeachment in comparison to that impeachment?
That's a good question. I mean, her situation, of course, was so radically different than what we're talking about now. She was treated, she went through a terrible ordeal, not to let her off the hook. I mean, obviously she takes responsibility for her own actions, but nobody at that age would want to go through what she went through with the incredible maelstrom of media attention. And while I don't think the New York Times and the Washington Post were the most unfair of them, she obviously had to live through a lot of tabloid stuff that was very cruel and presented a picture of her that was unfair and stereotypical and sexist. My memory of covering that at the time was that she was a very smart person, smarter than most of the congressmen that we were covering at the time. She handled herself very well. She ran rings around the people who were interviewing her when she went before the Senate trial, because she knew by that point much better how to answer their questions than they knew how to ask them. And she has been scarred by a pretty rough media circus. Today, there's nobody quite like that, and there's no sort of young figure who got caught up in something that was beyond what they had imagined might happen. What we have is government officials coming forward and testifying at this point anyway with the Congress to talk about the president's use of his power of his office. It's different in that sense. There's not the same kind. It's not as tabloid as that one was, because we're not talking about Sachs and we're not talking about those kinds of things. There's no dress. There's no DNA test. So in some ways, this is it's both more restrained and more combustible at the same time, because we have more media, more social media, more everything than we did back then. We didn't have Twitter back then. I know it seems impossible to believe. We didn't have Facebook. We didn't have any of those things. We didn't have phones. You didn't read your news on the phone. You actually sat down with a physical newspaper. During the Monica thing, I wrote a story when, I think this is right, when the House Judiciary Committee, I think when they voted to impeach Clinton, and it was the first time, that story that day was the first time the Washington Post ever published a story online that hadn't been in the paper. Like, all we did up to that point, our website was just what was in the print paper that day. We never interrupted the website to give you breaking news. It was the first time we ever did that. That's how much has changed from then to now. Now, my thing has buzzed 3 or 4 times since we've been up here. That's probably the president tweeting away. There may be 4 or 5 other news stories that have happened since we've been talking. And the acceleration is so extraordinary and so hard to get your hands around, both for the political class and for the media and for the general public. How do we know what to make of all this? And so our challenge in the media is to try to help you make some sense of it.
Hi. So in your recent piece discussing Trump's attack on what he calls the deep state, you mentioned the mass exodus of public service officials. Do you think that there is a possibility of rebuilding the federal government and having these intelligent and excellent dedicated Americans back into our government again? Or is there too much mistrust and animosity sown within government for that really to be rebuilt and be efficient?
It's a great question, and I think that reminds us that the people who work for our government, the vast majority of them anyway, do so under Republicans and Democrats, and they are serving the public and not a political party. And that's the way they view their jobs. I've known them for too long. A lot of people in here either might have worked for the government or knows people, or your family might have done that. The vast majority of federal workers and career employees are dedicated to the idea that it's not their job to make political decisions, but to help the elected leaders make their decisions the best way they can. But there's no question that there has been this struggle between Trump and the career workforce. A lot of people in the career workforce who were close up to him were very alarmed by the things he was doing, and in some cases did try to do things to thwart him. And he has seen that as evidence of a larger conspiracy. He makes it out to be a much more sinister and nefarious interpretation of events. But you're right, we've seen this clash, and the exodus, for those who might not have seen the article, of people from the senior career force is 40% higher under President Trump than it was under President Obama. So there is a hollowing out of that workforce. I don't think anything like that's permanent. I think it all depends on who comes next and how this ends, and I think if a President Pence or a President Haley were in there, much less a Democratic president, I think there'd be a different attitude toward, the career force, and I think people would probably, younger people would be rising up. Let's clear out a little bit of room for younger people like yourself to start doing some good things for the government.
Thank you for being here. I completely trust that reporters would try to report the truth, but there's something else I'm concerned about, like the information that gets ignored that are like for example, there's a thread. There are 2 threads going to 2 ends, and you are going towards one thread because you think that might serve or go with what you think is the truth better, but then there could be another thread that could lead to another aspect of truth because, things are always very comprehensive and there are always two sides of it. So do you think there are chances that reporters would deliberately ignore the other thread, the other parts of the truth? And how do you think about that?
It's a great question. And what stories are we missing because we are so phenomenally obsessed with Trump? Big question, and one we think about all the time. No question we have, like, if you look at our front page, some days it seems like it's just the Trump Times. I get that. I'm tired of it like everybody else. But the truth is that, he is the big story right now for a lot of reasons. But that doesn't mean we should overlook other threats or other stories or other issues. And I think we're trying very hard not to. We have 1,500 people now working for the editorial side, that is the publication side, the journalists at the New York Times. That's the most ever. That's the most ever. In my office, in the Washington Bureau, we have, I think, about 115 people now working there on the newspaper. We had 70 when Trump took office, so we have increased by 50%. So we are committed to doing not just Trump, but everything. We've created teams to look at climate change. We're doing a remarkable series of really good stories about climate change, because even though this administration might not be all that interested in that subject or talking about it a lot, we still think it's something important we should cover. We have so many talented and remarkable reporters that we do stick them on stories that are off the main conversation channel because we don't think they should be overlooked. But inevitably there are only so many reporters and only so many pages in the newspaper on any given day. Even the internet is not completely infinite. And so I'm sure we do miss stories, but we're very conscious of what you're talking about. We're very conscious of not being so Trump-centric that we lose sight of what's happening else around the world. If you pick up our paper, man, you could not read a single Trump story and still find enormous numbers of really interesting and important and compelling stories in our paper, whether it be what's happening in Hong Kong, whether it be what's happening in Syria, whether it be what's happening in Myanmar or across our country in so many different ways. And so, but your point is well taken. I think that's something that we should remind ourselves of every day.
So how serious was the reaction amongst your colleagues and your sources to Bill Taylor testifying 2 days ago that Trump made aid to Ukraine contingent upon those investigations?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a really interesting moment. Bill Taylor is what we were talking about earlier. This guy was served his country for 50 years. He went to West Point. He served 60 years in the military, including in Vietnam. Diplomat, ambassador to multiple places, and he's not easily dismissed as a partisan figure. He's not a political hack. He's somebody who was appointed ambassador by George W. Bush. He got his start under Ronald Reagan. He worked for Democrats. He worked for Republicans. So when he says that, you have to take it seriously. Now, deconstruct what he said. He didn't talk to Trump. He didn't talk to President Trump. All right. So his information is, in that sense, if you want to know what President Trump did or said, his information is secondhand. He was in Kiev. He was in Ukraine. But he presents enough details about what this person said or that person said that undercut the president's denial that there was any quid pro quo there. Right? The president said, yeah, I held up the aid, and yeah, I tried to pressure them for information about Biden and other Democrats, but these two things are not linked. Well, first of all, Mick Mulvaney came out and said the other day that they were linked, not the Biden part, but the 2016 Democrats part. He said they were linked, and then he said they weren't. And now Bill Taylor is saying he thinks that they were linked, and he was in a position to have more insight in it than you and I do. So I think that's a big moment. A lot of Republicans were very bothered by that. I don't think that means that they necessarily are ready to break with the president, and they're not saying it publicly in many cases. But a lot of Republicans looked at that and thought that was very troubling. And they're worried about what else might come out. If this comes out from Bill Taylor, what else are we going to learn? And that's why you don't see a lot of Republicans coming out and defending the president right now. They're attacking the process, right? If Republicans want to defend President Trump right now, what they're doing is attacking the process. The Democrats are being unfair. They're doing this behind closed doors. They should do it out front. They should give some more due process to the president. It's a witch hunt, whatever line you want to go with. They're not saying, hey, what he did was fine. When Mitch McConnell was asked the other day, hey, the president says you told him that the call with the Ukrainian president was perfect. Did you say that? He says, no, I didn't say that. That's not what he said. He's not throwing the president of the bus. He's also not willing to defend on the substance of what he did. That's a really interesting dynamic right now. It's not that different than the Clinton thing. No Democrat wanted to defend what he did back in 1998. They attacked the process. Newt Gingrich is being unfair. He's railroading him. It's a coup. All these words you're hearing now from the Republicans, you heard from the Democrats back then. Different subject matter, right? Not lying about sex under oath, but some of the dynamics are similar. The politics are similar. And we'll see if the outcome is different.
So you talked a lot about how in the past there's like 3 main news channels, but now there's like a lot of different news channels. And you also talked a lot and were very sincere about reporting the truth. But how would you balance bias that comes from different news channels with reporting truth, and how does that work?
So, tell me more about what you mean. How would I buy it? How would I?
Like when you're reporting and there's different news like channels.
Right.
There's obviously bias based off what that news
Right.
channel is.
Right.
So how do you balance bias and reporting truth, or
Got it.
what does that mean?
Well, one thing we did, in fact, when we were reporting the Monica story at the Washington Post, one thing we did was we resolved to never report anything that somebody else had reported unless we could confirm it ourselves. Okay, that's not necessarily a hard and fast rule today, but it's still a pretty good rule that we mostly follow. Just because Fox News reports something, or MSNBC, or BuzzFeed, or somebody else reports something, we're not going to just throw that out into our newspaper just because somebody else reported it. We want to make sure that we can report with our sources, we can evaluate that information ourselves, bias-free, hopefully, or at least with as little bias as possible. We're all human, everybody's biased. But not to simply accept somebody else's interpretation of an event or facts. Not because we don't trust anybody else, but because we want our product to live up to our standards. So if I see something in another news organization, I may chase the story, see if it's true. I'm not going to necessarily accept it without making sure.
Hello.
Where am I?
I have 2 questions, and can you just answer the one that you prefer?
Oh, I like that. That's good.
Okay, the first question is, how do you think President Donald Trump has changed American politics? And then the second one is, do you think that there's information in Washington and about the Washington elite that's being withheld from the public right now?
Well, tell me the last one. What do you mean by that?
Is there secret information? I mean, that we don't know.
I'm trying to get it all for you. I'm trying to find all of it. Yeah.
Okay.
Look, I'll answer both your questions because you're nice enough to give me a choice. But on the second one, are there secrets in Washington? Absolutely, yes, absolutely. And that's why we have 118 people, 115 people in Washington, because we're out there trying to find those secrets just for you. All right? It's our job to bust secrets. We are in the anti-secret business. All right? And that's whether it's Democrat or Republican, I don't care, it doesn't matter to me. We are in the anti-secret business. Now, are there some things that government knows that are secret that we wouldn't publish? Sometimes people ask us that. Sometimes. Not very often. Our bias, if you want to talk about bias, our bias is toward publishing. That's what we do. We are publishing. We are publication. But from time to time, we learn something of a national security element in which a government official might make the case to us that publishing it would be dangerous for this reason or that reason. And our policy is to hear them out, to listen to them make that argument to us, and then to consider it based on our own judgment, and then decide whether we think they have a good case or not. If, for instance, we had secret cables, right, from the State Department that we weren't supposed to have, that we got a hold of, and it included Social Security numbers, right, or maybe the names of Afghan informers who were helping us against the Taliban, things like that. And the government said, hey, if you publish that, somebody in Afghanistan, for instance, could get killed. Or if you publish somebody's Social Security number, you're putting them at risk. Okay, those are reasonable arguments, right? I think most of us would agree that we could withhold that information from our readers without damaging the public need to know news, but still understanding the consequences of publishing something that's a secret. But if they tell us, hey, we've been running a secret surveillance program that's collecting Americans' phone records for 10 years, and we haven't told them, and we think you ought not to publish that because really it will be embarrassing to us, that's not going to fly with us. We're going to publish that. That's not a very compelling argument. Unfortunately, a lot of times government officials say, we don't want you to publish things for national security reasons. What they really mean is we don't want you to publish things because it will embarrass us. Or we'll have a really, a lot of questions to answer from Congress or something like that. That's not our problem. That's their problem. And so we don't find that very compelling. Your first question was...
Can I change my first question?
Yes.
Okay, who is your favorite journalist of all time?
Oh, my favorite journalist of all time? That's a great question.
Is it Morley?
Sorry?
Is it Morley from 60 Minutes?
Morley Safer was a great journalist, yes, great journalist. I would probably say, you mean other than my wife, who's the greatest journalist I know? True, it's true. My wife, Susan Glasser, she's at the New Yorker now. She was my editor when we met at the Washington Post. Yeah. Some Me Too things work out okay. If she were here, she would kill me. She would tell you I was not his supervisor. I did not determine his pay. So you assigned me stories, you edited me stories. Okay. Anyway, she's really, really a fabulous journalist. If you don't read her column from Washington every week, you ought to. Aside from my wife, I would mention Ben Bradley, who was the editor of the Washington Post, hired me. If nothing else, that makes him, I thought, pretty good. Played by Jason Robards in All the President's Men. If you young students haven't seen it, please watch it. It's the best movie ever. He was a brave guy. He took on an administration when that was scary, and when everything was at stake. If you had another movie you might watch, maybe you have seen this one, The Post, with Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks plays the Bradley character in that one. That's about publishing the Pentagon Papers. Taking on the government when the government has all the power, that was a brave thing to do. And it set a tone and it set a standard that all of us have lived with since then. So not having given it a lot of thought, I would put him in that category.
We're almost out of time. Let me ask what might be a final question. I think the Academy was caught off guard by Trump's election, just as everybody was. And if you survey what kinds of things people are doing research on, what kinds of things people are writing about now, there's a lot more interest in populism. What are the earlier periods when we had it? What did it do? What did it mean? There are people writing about tyranny. There are people writing about the European democracies that declined. I suspect in the English department there are a lot more people reading King Lear. Okay, there's something to be learned. What is it that you want to know more about that isn't our everyday news that would help you understand Washington now?
Yeah, that is a great question, and it really goes to something really important. I'm going to repeat something we talked about earlier in the smaller session. For those who heard it, I apologize. I mean, I think one thing you should understand about 2016 is, everybody says, the media got it wrong, right? We got it wrong. They told us Hillary Clinton was going to win. Fair enough. Take our lumps. The truth is, though, the polls were right. They were broadly right. They said she had a 2, 3, 4-point lead. In the end, that's what she won by in the popular vote, right? The poll wasn't measuring the Electoral College. It was measuring the national popular vote within the margin of error. The problem is when we take small amounts of data and extrapolate them and make them into bigger things than they ought to be. Like we collectively took 2 or 3 or 4-point poll numbers and said, that means she has a 92% chance of winning. Ridiculous. Nonsense. We should not be predicting things. That's something journalists should avoid. We should not predict things. That's one thing I would say. Secondly, I think that we have to make the danger for us is losing touch with the country simply because there is a disproportionate number of journalists who live in the Acela corridor, right? We got to get out. We got to get out of our offices. We got to get out of our cities. We got to get out of our comfort zone, and we've got to get out and understand the country that we live in. And I work for a paper based in Manhattan, and I work in Washington, D.C. These are not the most representative places in the world. And we need to find ways of getting past that bubble, that predisposition, and open our minds. And one thing I think that we got wrong was in 2016 was because something had never happened before, we thought it couldn't happen. And we need to open our minds a little bit more. Just because we think something hasn't happened before doesn't mean it won't happen or couldn't happen. That's something we've seen a lot, I think, in the last few years. So what would help me understand Washington more is to, again, spend more time out in the real world, quote, quote, and do it without looking like we're, we shouldn't be condescending or look like it's somehow alien. It should be who we are. Our friends, our families, everybody in America is part of our collective family. I go to these Trump rallies and I try to talk to people there because they're seeing things differently than the Washington establishment sees things. And they're seeing a guy who encourages them because he's fighting for them. And they see it. They see him as a bracing figure who is standing up to fill in the blank, the fake news, the terrible Democrats, the swamp, whatever. And it's not, people talk about race or economics or culture or social issues, and all those things are important. I think there's a tribalism. There's an us versus them quality right now to our politics. And if they're after him, they're after us. And I think that's the thing we got to get our hands around is how is this us versus them thing playing out? We are segregating ourselves as a society, not just along ethnic or racial lines, but around ideas, around ideology, around philosophy, around experience, about attitudes and viewpoints. The demographers have a number. I think the number is 800. If you live in a place with more than 800 people per square mile, you're twice as likely to be a Democrat. And if you live in a place with fewer than that, you're twice as likely to be a Republican. And we talk about our multiplication of media, which is generally, I think, a good thing. We've got a much bigger marketplace of ideas. That's a healthy, good thing. But we live in our corners. We don't interact with each other. I'm going to watch my channel, and you're going to watch your channel. We're not going to interact. We're not going to talk to each other. We don't want to talk to each other. Polls showed in the early 1960s, they asked this question, would it bother you if your son or daughter married somebody from the other political party? Right? The number was like 4 or 5% back then. Today it's closer to 50%. Right? I don't want no Republican at my Thanksgiving table. I don't want no Democrat coming over for Christmas. We don't even want to interact with each other as much anymore. We're siloing ourselves. And how does the media then respond to that? How do we cover a country where we live such different lives and different viewpoints without, oversimplifying, caricaturing, or losing the sophisticated tapestry that makes us a country? And I'm not the person with the best answer to that. I'm just a reporter. But those are things we got to talk about.
Well, whenever you need to get out of Washington, the Shenandoah Valley is close, and it could give you some perspective. Absolutely. I need to ask the audience to applaud for two things, our guest and for the excellent questions we had this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys.